Hello everyone, and welcome to another Crunch Element devlog. This is going to be a huge recap. There's so much to talk about, so I think the best way to do this is to jump right into it chronologically of what happened at the beginning of this year and where the project is now and what you can expect. So starting off after this may be in January, after going over player feedback, doing a bunch of hot fixes, things like this, I really was able to take a step back and really look hard at the feedback of the players. And one of the biggest points of feedback was content, and rightfully so, right? Even in my mind, I was like, okay, content, content, content. But in my mind, that was, okay, more procedural generation. Now, January, February, and March were all dedicated to procedural generation, really exploring the limits of what was possible there. And what I mean by that is new features were experimented with, like procedural terrain, semi-procedural levels where there were like handmade modules in a massive procedural world, multiple procedural compounds, multiple objectives, bunch of crazy stuff. And at the end of the day, after all was said and done, it still kind of lacked that purpose. There was like a perpetual really feeling of it's got potential, like something was always on the edge of like, there's just it's almost there, but it never was. And the reason is procedural generation really lacks conceptual integrity. What do I mean by that? Well, I ran a test after I was looking at the clock in March saying, okay, this is taking a ridiculous amount of time, of a handmade level. And I put it out, I believe, on the experimental branch saying, hey, this is an example of a handmade scenario, something that was built intentionally, something built with conceptual integrity, something that had kind of a cohesive purpose to it. And the response to that was great. And it was fun. And testing it with players was eye-opening because doing something like that took a fraction of the time for procedural generation. You can have much more diversity of levels, of layouts, of compounds. And most importantly, there's so much time and resources available to focus on what makes Crunch Element great. Because as I kind of took a big picture, bird's eye view of the project in March, I asked myself, where does Crunch Element fit into the VR market of 2021? Meaning, what does it do well? Why would somebody look at this game and purchase it and play it and share it? And is that reason procedural generation? Or is it destruction and breach and clear, which is the flagship mechanics of the game? And it's quite obvious that it was destruction. That's in the name, Crunch Element. And when I really was able to kind of take a big picture view of that, I was like, wait a minute, how much time has actually been spent on procedural generation at the expense of AI, performance, destruction, weapons, attachments, things like that, all the like fun stuff, the flagship stuff. And I was estimating like 80% of the project was procedural generation. And I said, hold on a minute. What would the game look like if all those resources of time, just time, was available to make it great, to focus on what makes it unique, what makes Crunch Element unique, which is doing destruction, doing breaching and clearing, doing handmade scenarios really, really, really well with unique objectives, with a solid progression system, and something that you can reliably have a great experience with. And it's bloody hard to do that with procedural generation consistently. Consistently is the operative part of that word there. Because if you want to add something like a cool level layout or an archway or even just a new kind of procedural strategy, a new procedural element, just pick anything, to incorporate that in a procedural context is 5 to 10 times at least more time and energy than if you were just adding that by hand in a non-procedural context, if that makes sense. So long story short, a procedural generation is no way out of the picture. I do want to have a kind of enclosed system of a procedural level that you play. Perhaps you can tweak the parameters pretty close to what you can do now, except I want much more of a focus on the interaction systems, the breaching, the destruction, all the things that make Crunch Element unique and great. So what does it mean to focus on what makes Crunch Element great? Well, a couple things. And really it's all the features that and systems that complement that breaching and clearing and really just the gameplay rather than kind of the big structural elements like the level flow and things like that. So one of the biggest things is the rework of the interaction system. Now that's ready to be tested. It's actually on a different branch, a test interaction branch, and it works over the network, and that was from like March till now, basically September, completely redoing all of the items, all the way interactions handled, the player rig, everything. And I'm so glad that that's finally come full circle and is ready to be tested thoroughly. So what does that mean? Well, for starters, physics interaction is a thing, and it's the world is much more tangible to the player. So for example, you can move barricades, which are also synced over the network. You can have, say, like a sledgehammer and breach walls with that, which is actually cool and a really highly requested feature. So thanks for everybody who recommended that. New equipment and also refactored equipment that has some different characteristics. For example, the wall charge, rather than having some arbitrary dedicated breach binding, there's now a clacker on the wall charge. So you put it on a wall or you take the charge out and it's now physical. So you grab that and you press the trigger and it breaches. And it just cleans up so much by having things in the physical world. So you pick up something and then your bindings are now relative to that thing you picked up rather than like just random bindings for everything. So the point is it's much better now. And one of the other big kind of revisions and a different way of looking at the new interaction system is kind of the player inventory, which is basically two things. One is the hotbar on the player, which is like the holster slots, except now there's a ton of them. There's small, medium, and large holster slots, so not necessarily for specific parts of your loadout, but for anything that you kind of set up before you go into a mission, but also stuff that you find there. So for example, your loadout could consist of a rifle, a pistol, and a breaching charge, and a grenade, and that will show up including the magazines in all of those holsters. So you can have, you basically have 6 different small holsters, 2 medium and 1 large on your avatar. So you can have some cool combinations with that because your mags will spawn here. You can move them however you want, like an actual chest rig. And when you find magazines and things like that in game, or maybe medical equipment later on in a future update, you just put them on your kind of hot bar. And if that runs out, you also now have a backpack that you can just pull over, and it has a bunch of slots in there as well. And what this really does is it changes the way you look at items in the game. So I really want to kind of introduce more of like grab as you go kind of stuff, like stuff laying around you pick up and it might be useful later. I want to see how that plays out with shorter levels, longer levels, and kind of experiment with that. But that's one of the biggest changes there that the interaction system brings. Now, on the topic of loadouts and setting up your kind of rig, I guess, is the attachment system, which is brand new and it's been in the works for a while. And it really didn't get done because I was waiting on this interaction update, which is finally done. And it really takes a different perspective on weapons. So before it was, say you have an M4, you have a Mark 18, you have a M4 ISR, internally suppressed thing. You have all these variations of these weapons, which are kind of redundant. So now the focus is on weapon bases. So an M4 base or an AR base. You have a 5.56 caliber, and it's up to the player to configure that to however they want. So you can choose different muzzle devices like suppressors, war comps, compensators, you name it. Stuff on rails, grips, lights, lasers, optics, the whole ball of wax. And if an item shares, say, kind of a same mount point like a rail or a 9mm muzzle, those attachments are interchangeable. So that's something really interesting that I want to get some feedback on and see how that plays out in the game itself. And let's see, after that, you have now new interaction system, you have new attachments. Now it's about bringing it all together, which is why the next step is really extensive testing to break things on this small contained scale before scaling it up and adding a ton of weapons or a ton of attachments or a ton of handmade levels. Figure out ways to break this now before all that gets added. It's not the end of the world, stuff obviously creeps up, which it will, like bugs will pop up here and there, but the more that can be resolved now, the better off it's going to be in the future. So for example, there will only be one of each category to test on now on the interaction branch, which is why it's not on the default branch that you load up on Steam. So for example, an M4, a pistol, a bunch of attachments for each of them, one of each item, equipment really. And the goal is to break those at this small scale before you add a ton of content like that. So that's what I'm looking at now. Right now in the works as well as lighting is making it look really great, making it performant, and making it scalable. And that's closing up soon, and it's looking really great. But right now, I'm super excited because everything is finally coming together after so much building, taking down, reworking, reiterating, and that's part of the process. There's some stuff where you make a prototype and that ends up not being the direction you go. That's still progress, even if it's now redundant, because it's the knowledge that was learned there. And I'm now extremely excited that I'm closing in on a concrete design of the game, of basically a spec of what is the end goal of this game. And again, it revolves around a focus on breaching, on destruction, on all of those elements, on mastery. And a lot of that's fleshed out, and a lot of that's open to feedback of what players discover as they're testing. But the bottom line is, I greatly appreciate everyone's patience. I hope you break a bunch of stuff now so I can figure out what it is and fix that, because scaling up is going to be an exciting endeavor now that everything's polished. There's a physics-based interaction system. The networking is now more stable. All of that has finally come together, and I'm super excited to now be able to share it with you. And I hope to see you on another devlog or out in the compounds or on the Discord. And I really appreciate everybody's support, and I'm looking forward to another great few weeks, months, and year.